Happy Wednesday, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Dana Neeson, and today I am bringing you an article that the Wall Street Journal published in February of this year. The article is titled, How the Funeral Industry Got the FTC to Hide Bad Actors. We're going to talk about this article today, why it's relevant to you if you're selling final expense insurance, and why it's more important than ever to sell an advocacy program attached to your final expense policy so we can make sure these clients are protected. Buckle up, we're going to take a deep dive into the corruption on final expense telesales. If you are just now finding this channel, thank you for being here. My name is Dana Neeson. I run a telesales team for Tailored Legacy. We sell final expense insurance over the phone with one carrier, Lincoln Heritage. My job is to help you have stronger, more sophisticated sales conversations, but today I would like to open your eyes to the bigger picture. The picture that is beyond selling a life insurance policy, the picture that is beyond being a broker and having multiple carriers and all you worry about is selling on price. Even if you sell mortgage protection insurance or IULs or term, this still applies to you because what is the very first thing that all families will have to pay for and prepare for when a loved one passes away? Yes, it is the funeral. This impacts everybody of every race, every gender, every nationality, every income level, and the funeral homes take advantage of grieving families every single day and have for decades. According to this Wall Street Journal article, it starts with, unethical funeral homes have exploited grieving customers for decades. What consumers may not know is that many of the industry's bad actors have been hidden from the public thanks to a sweetheart deal struck between the Federal Trade Commission and the funeral industry more than 25 years ago. We talk to families every single day, thousands of families per year that have all been impacted by the rising costs of funeral expenses. But it's not just rising costs due to inflation. It is rising costs due to the corruption that exists in the funeral industry. Now, I want to just put a caution out right now. I know not every funeral home is corrupt. There are a lot of funeral homes that are still family run, that are not owned by these large, giant conglomerates, that are doing the right thing for grieving families and still making a living at the same time. I am not talking about those funeral homes, so please don't get triggered here. But look, if the Wall Street Journal is going to publish an article about the corruption and how funeral homes are in bed with the FTC, it's something we should talk about. To fully understand how this story even came to be, we have to take you way back to the 1980s and 1990s when large corporations were buying up small family-run funeral homes for profit. In fact, if you've ever seen the recent movie The Burial with Jamie Foxx, it actually depicts a real-life story of how one of these large corporations was going into low-income cities across the country, buying up family-run funeral homes, and then just marking up the prices for profit. I highly recommend you watch that movie if you haven't already. Back when this is all taking place, it caused the FTC to look into the funeral industry and felt that because there were so many deceptive practices happening, that they invoked what's called the funeral rule. I'm going to read you from the FTC's website what that funeral rule is designed to do, and then we're going to talk about why it doesn't work. So it reads, under the FTC's funeral rule, consumers have the right to get a general price list from a funeral provider when they ask about funeral arrangements. They also have the right to choose the funeral goods and services they want, with some exceptions, and funeral providers must state this right on the general price list, meaning they don't have to buy the casket from the funeral home. They can buy it from a third-party site and have it shipped without being charged for doing so. If state or local law requires purchase of any particular item, the funeral provider must disclose it on the price list with a reference to the specific law. The funeral provider may not refuse or charge a fee to handle a casket brought elsewhere, and a provider offering cremations must make alternative containers available. The FTC conducts undercover inspections every year to make sure that funeral homes are complying with the agency's funeral rule. The funeral rule applies anytime a consumer seeks information from a funeral provider, whether the consumer is asking about pre-need or at-need arrangements. On the surface, That sounds good. Like the consumers prior to this law were never able to see a general price list. They would just be at the mercy of whatever the funeral director told them it was going to be, which means they did not have the ability to compare pricing online or shop around. Now, when someone passes away, the flaw here is are people really in the right state of mind to shop their loved one's funeral? Are they really going to pick up the phone and make 3 or 4 calls? Do they really know the questions to ask? Do they really know how things cost? Are they going online, and is it easy to find this price list? Because it's not. It is very difficult to find it, and then the way that they have it listed is difficult to even comprehend and understand. Failure to comply with this funeral rule really only was led with warnings and small fines, which most funeral homes ignored and didn't even pay. Worst case scenario, there could end up in lawsuits and shut the funeral home down. When the funeral rule was put into place, besides undercover investigations, the FTC was literally relying on consumers to file these complaints. How would a consumer even know what their rights are if the law was just published to funeral homes? Like, it literally makes no sense. So to make things even worse, I'm going to read you a direct quote from the article. When the FTC would send out undercover agents like secret shoppers who would check on the compliance, the FTC would sue the funeral homes that had multiple violations. The lawsuits were cumbersome and costly, and the funeral industry's main lobbying group, the National Funeral Directors Association, the NFDA, felt that these lawsuits were hitting their reputation. Well, no crap. They were hitting their reputation. So in the 1990s, the NFDA approached the FTC with the following idea. They proposed to come up with an arrangement that would benefit all parties: funeral homes, the National Funeral Director Association, and the FTC. What they proposed and what is in effect was that when a funeral home was found to have violated the funeral rule, instead of going through the litigation route, which would bring attention to the fact that they are overcharging and being corrupt, they would have the option to join a program called the Funeral Rule Offenders Program that was completely run by the National Funeral Directors Association. So if the funeral home violated the rule, it would be given the option to make a payment in the amount of almost $2,000 to the government that is supposed to regulate them, to the FTC, and take a training course that was run by the lobbyist group that wanted to cover it up. And if it completed the training, its violations wouldn't be made public and held secret. Can we just unpack this for a second? Talk about the total corruption and people being in bed with each other. The government agency that is supposed to be protecting consumers are now getting paid by the funeral homes that are violating the law and taking a course, slap on the wrist, I won't do it again, and then we're going to cover it up. You tell me where the consumer rights are here. Someone in the article said, yeah, it's basically like foxes guarding the hen house. If the goal is to prevent consumers from getting overcharged and taken advantage of by the funeral homes, has it actually worked? Has it reduced the price gouging? Has it reduced the poor behavior by the funeral homes because of said courses and slaps on the wrist and paying less than a $2,000 fine to the FTC? No. In fact, since 1996, when the program was first put into effect, the compliance has actually worsened and not improved at all. This is why it is more important than ever to have an advocate by grieving families' side who know the ins and outs of the funeral role, of the funeral industry, who aren't just selling cheap caskets and discounted hardware, but actually have a real person 24 hours a day, 7 days a week at that moment when somebody is gone to be able to pull up a database of over 30,000 funeral homes and be able to offer families options, to be able to request things like a price list, to be able to know things that the families would never, ever even think of knowing, right? You don't know what you don't know. So if you've never experienced planning or paying for a funeral before, even if you have, you are at the mercy of what the funeral director tells you what the cost is. And when you are grieving and when you are not in the right state of mind, you will pay. In fact, even the Kraft family themselves, who founded the Funeral Consumer Guardian Society, have spoken on this article directly. And I'm going to play a few minutes of the stories from this article of the families who were overcharged and how the Funeral Consumer Guardian Society could have made a difference.
Death is hard. It is tough to make good decisions, even if you have a plan in place and you are at the best funeral home. You need an advocate to give you the peace of mind to know you're in that good situation. And you need an aggressive advocate to give you the savings when you're in a bad situation with a bad funeral home. That is exactly what we do here at Funeral Consumer Guardian Society. Now, in the article, they mentioned three or four examples of families being violated by the funeral industry. I want to go through each of these and then talk about FCGS's advocacy and how it has intervened in similar situations in the past. Now, the first story they bring up is about a gentleman named Thomas Schoenberger. His father passed away in May of 2022, and he told Gorsline Ronseman Funeral Home in Michigan that he wanted the simplest of funerals for his no frills dude of a dad. Now, Gorsline is an SCI funeral home. SCI stands for Service Corp International. It is the largest funeral conglomerate in the United States. And in 2017, this particular funeral home was cited for failing to disclose prices to customers. Now, he did not discuss prices much with the funeral director, but he did decline a viewing, chose minimal services, and picked an inexpensive casket involved. He expected to pay $8,000. The bill ended up being $17,000 with a $4,355 basic services fee that the funeral director couldn't even explain. He tried to move funeral homes, but would have been stuck with a $2,000 bill for the pickup and removal and other services already rendered. His final bill at that funeral home ended up being $14,473.42. Now let's imagine Thomas's dad was an FCGS member, which he should have been. First, we have a plan on file telling Thomas that he wants him to keep it simple. This prevents the funeral director of using his emotional state to change his mind. Now, in this case, it doesn't sound like that happened because Thomas knew what his dad wanted. The problem with this case is the funeral director took advantage of the knowledge gap, the knowledge that the funeral director had and the knowledge that the consumer lacked. The first thing an FCGS representative would have done is price shop options before they select that funeral home. We would have let him know that Gorsline is going to run around $15,000, and it is an SCI funeral home known for higher prices. We would have also probably given him an option of another funeral home in the area, like a Riley funeral home, that might be more reasonable. The reason I say this is because we actually helped a family a couple months before Thomas went through his ordeal. We helped a family there in Lansing, Michigan. In this case, we are helping them with a direct cremation. We priced out Gorsline because that's the funeral home this particular family wanted to use. And the cremation was more than $3,500. We also found Riley Funeral Home just a few blocks away that would be able to do that same cremation for $2,300. And then finally, we found a discount option that's a little further away that would be able to do it for less than $2,000. That is what we do. I know we would have helped him in that price shopping process. But even if Thomas would have still selected Gorsline Funeral Home, which happens all the time, we have families that use SCI funeral homes all the time, we still would have been able to help him save money and keep his bill at a reasonable amount. We would, even if you still select Gorsline, let's say they have cemetery property in their cemetery, we still would have been able to demand that contract and been able to review that to see if there's any items that could be removed. The big thing we would have done is given him some other options. We would have discussed options like direct burial without embalming, and then you can do the service at the cemetery or the church on your own at a later date. That price at Gorsline would have been less than $10,000. We are here to help, and we can help in any way that is needed. The next example brought up in the article is about Courtney Stewart, who lost her mom in 2012. She paid $5,000 for a direct cremation at Seaver Brown Funeral Service in Virginia. She later learned that they own another funeral home in the area that would cost $1,000 for the exact same services. The article tries to make it a point that regulation mandating funeral homes post prices online would have fixed Miss Stewart's problem. We disagree. Again, this is a cost of the business. Death is hard. The last thing you are thinking about doing is Googling funeral home prices and searching their website to see if you got it correct. Not to mention the fact that the general price list is a difficult document to understand to begin with. It may have helped Miss Stewart, but it is not a sure-proof fix. And we see this issue all over the country. Funeral homes offering multiple tiers of options in order to capture all of the market. My favorite conglomerate like this is Shedinger Funeral Home out of Columbus. And Shedinger used to be one of the largest and longest family-run funeral homes in the country. A couple years ago, it just sold to Service Corp International. But before that, they had their Shedinger location that would charge families $4,000 for direct cremation. Actually, I think a little more than that. They had another location with under a different name that would charge the family $1,500. And then finally, they had their online company that could do the direct cremation for less than $1,000. This happens everywhere. And guess what? SCI does it too. So just because they sold to SCI doesn't mean that still isn't happening in Columbus. Now they have their Shedinger location, and SCI's discount crematory options are Advantage Cremation and Funeral Services. You've probably seen that all across the country, as well as Neptune Society is owned by SCI. We help every day. Every single day, we help families find these low-cost, affordable options, especially when it comes to direct cremation. And nothing would have been different for this particular example. The next example is a quick one, but I want to bring it up. They bring up is a lady living in the Nevada desert with her grandfather who passed away. She said first responders called the funeral home, which this happens sometimes when death is sudden. And first, if her grandma, let's just talk about if her grandfather were an FCGS member, we would hopefully have a plan on file. We would be able to quickly price shop and find a funeral home that would be affordable. We also would let her know that she is not responsible for paying the pickup and removal fee that was charged because the first responders released the body into the care of a funeral home that she had not signed off on. She would not be responsible for those charges. Again, it's about planning and education. And then the final example is one we see all too often. And this one the article brings up is from Vallejo, California. And Rhonda Bennett's 53-year-old brother had passed away from a stroke. Now, just stop right there. Think about it. If you know somebody that's 53 and they passed away suddenly one day and you were responsible for making those funeral arrangements, are you going to be able to make good decisions when you're going through that emotional time in your life? She is in no space to make good decisions. Now, she says the funeral home pushed her to buy a $2,300 casket instead of a similar one she found online for less than $2,000. The funeral director told her if she bought the casket online, he would charge her about $7,000 for other services a la carte. So not rolled up in a discount funeral package. His discount funeral package option, instead of $7,000, would have been $3,495. But you have to purchase that $2,300 casket from his funeral home. He also said that her family had to be present at the time the casket was delivered and that they had to dispose of the packaging themselves. Now, the last two things there, being responsible for being there when it's delivered and disposing of the packaging, is actually spelled out in the funeral rule that is not allowed. The first part of that, where they're packaging everything up and then charging you more a la carte and less if you buy a casket through their funeral home, that actually is in line with the funeral rule. And you need an advocate like us to be able to help you through that process. And we do. We have an example from a family that we helped. We have a video right here on this site. Please go and watch if you have any questions about it. The family bought 2 caskets right here at FCGS Plus. That is describing a story about a family we helped in Michigan, and they were actually saving money by purchasing 2 caskets instead of 1. Very interesting story, almost exactly like Miss Bennett's story here in this Wall Street Journal article, and we're able to save this family thousands of dollars.
So there you have it. I mean, it really doesn't get more crystal clear to me than that. And the reason that I am with Lincoln Heritage, and the reason that so many of the agents that come here are so steadfast in what they do, is because we have the ability to provide much more than a monetary death benefit. We have the ability to actually change lives, to help people through the worst time in their lives. So to summarize this article from the Wall Street Journal, the biggest takeaway according to the article, and a quote directly from here, is I think there are a lot of funeral professionals who got into the business because they really do want to serve people. And like in any industry, there are bad actors, which is what they're calling them. I think what's challenging in the funeral industry is that you have these especially and uniquely vulnerable customers. And so I think if there are bad actors, the impact can be quite immense for a customer. And it does seem that the mechanisms that have been put in place to protect the consumers, or that are supposed to protect consumers, are not doing as good of a job as the folks who put them in place. If you learned something from this video today, please give it a like. Also, if something inspired you, if you got triggered by something, if you learned something at all, please post a comment. I love to engage and interact with this community that we have built over the last few years, and I will see you guys again on Friday.